My father said teaching wasn't a real career and called me a babysitter. Then I shocked him by controlling his grant. Welcome back with a new real shock story. Before we start, comment and tell me which city you're watching from. At the end, don't forget to subscribe and rate it from 0 to 10. Let's enjoy the story, everyone.
It started with a sentence that still echoes in my mind, like a cold wind cutting through summer. My father told me, plain and sharp, teaching isn't a real career. He said it like it was the worst insult he could give, as if all the hours I'd poured into lesson plans and classrooms meant nothing. And then, without hesitation, he added something that burned even deeper. He called me a babysitter. Just like that. Like I was doing nothing important in life. I was 25, fresh out of college, trying to build something meaningful, and the one person I'd hoped would believe in me told me I was wasting my life. That moment didn't just hurt. It lit something inside me. It made me feel small, but strangely alive. It was like being slapped and told, prove it. I wanted to prove him wrong. I wanted to show him that what I did mattered, that my career mattered. But I didn't know exactly how. I just knew I couldn't let him walk away thinking he was right. The strange part is, at that moment, I wasn't even aware how deep this fight would take me. I wasn't aware that years later, it would become something bigger. A story about pride, injustice, and truth. Something that would change the way I saw my father forever. That night, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the walls. The words kept playing in my head, over and over. I couldn't sleep. Babysitter. Not a real career. I thought about all the children I taught, the parents who thanked me, the progress I'd seen. None of that mattered to him, but maybe it mattered to me more than I realized. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying attention to him in a new way. My father was a man who had worked his whole life to secure grants for his projects. Money, he said, was for community programs. But I started noticing how he treated that money, how controlling he was. He guarded every dollar, every decision. I began wondering what would happen if that power wasn't his anymore. I tried to push the thought away. I told myself it was petty, that I was imagining things. But every time he spoke down to me, every time he mocked my work, the thought came back stronger. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One afternoon, months later, I stumbled on something that changed everything. I was at the local library, preparing a lesson plan, when I overheard two men talking about a grant my father had been awarded. One mentioned that certain conditions could allow someone else to take control of it if the work wasn't being done as agreed. I froze. My heart pounded. I wasn't supposed to hear this, but part of me knew this was the opening I had been waiting for. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about that conversation, turning it over in my mind. The injustice of what he had said to me was still fresh. But now it wasn't just about words. It was about proving something. About showing him and everyone else that my work was real, and that his idea of control wasn't absolute. I began researching quietly. Late nights in my small kitchen with my laptop, coffee cups piling up beside me. I read every word I could about grants, legal rules, rights, loopholes. Every discovery felt like a step deeper into something dangerous, but also something necessary, something that would test me. I remember one night sitting in the dark, staring at my screen, thinking, what if I could really take control of his grant? What if I could prove to him that I was capable of more than he'd ever imagined? But also, what would it mean if I did it? By then, I was hooked. The idea became an obsession. Every time he dismissed me, every time he laughed at my career choice, my resolve grew stronger. But I also knew this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just my fight. It was about proving a point bigger than me, about how society looks at certain jobs, how people decide what work is valuable, and who gets to say what matters. And so I made a decision. I wouldn't just accept his words. I would act. I would challenge him in the most direct way possible, and I would do it quietly, without him even knowing. What happened next changed everything. It started with a choice. A single moment where I decided I was done being underestimated. But I couldn't have known then how far I was stepping into something bigger than a family argument. Something that would lead me into a storm I wasn't ready for. And something that would force me to confront not just my father's beliefs, but my own. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my laptop open, my mind racing. I didn't just feel anger. I felt a strange kind of clarity. I knew there was no turning back. And so began my journey. The journey that would turn his words against him and change both of our lives forever. But what happened after that? How far could I go? How deep would I have to go before I could prove my point? That's where the real story begins. I woke up the next morning with a strange mix of dread and determination. My father's words were still there, etched in my mind like a brand. I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. Not a real career. Babysitter. It wasn't just an insult. It was a dismissal of my entire life, everything I'd worked for. And I wasn't going to let it stand. The day began quietly. I went to my teaching job, greeted my students, and tried to smile as I explained the day's lesson. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the night before. I kept thinking about that grant, the one my father guarded so carefully. It wasn't just money. To him, it was power. And I began to wonder, if I could take control of it, could I prove that I was worth more than what he said? After school, I found myself walking home through the old neighborhood, the streets lined with buildings that had seen generations of our family. The air was heavy with humidity, and I could hear the faint hum of traffic somewhere in the distance. I walked slowly, as if the ground itself wanted me to pause. At home, I sat down at my desk and pulled out my laptop. I began to dig deeper into grants and legal conditions. The more I read, the more possibilities I found. There were loopholes that could let someone else, like me, take control if the grant conditions weren't met. My heart raced as I imagined what it would mean, not just for me, but for him. But then doubt crept in. Could I really do this? Was I crossing a line? My father had spent decades building his reputation around that money. Taking it away, even for a point I believed in, felt dangerous. But every doubt seemed to vanish when I remembered his words. Every time he called me a babysitter, every time he told me teaching wasn't real work. Those words burned like fuel, and I knew they'd drive me forward. I started planning quietly. I told no one, not my friends, not my co-workers. This was mine. The more I researched, the more I realized the rules were complicated. But there was a pattern, a way through the confusion. It felt like a puzzle I had to solve, piece by piece. A week later, I found the first key. A clause buried deep in the paperwork that hinted at my father's vulnerability. It wasn't just a chance, it was an opening, but it came with risks. If I moved too soon, he could see it coming. If I moved too late, the opportunity might vanish. I began to watch him more closely. At first, it was subtle, catching how he spoke on the phone, watching when he checked the papers on his desk, listening to him complain about certain deadlines. There was something in his voice, a tension I hadn't noticed before. And I realized he was under pressure too. One evening, I followed him to the library where he often met with colleagues. He spoke quietly, but I caught words. Whoa, but he's about deadlines, about accountability, about money slipping away. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just about me proving myself anymore. This was about a battle that neither of us fully understood yet. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought about my life, about my choices, and about what I was about to do. It felt dangerous, and part of me feared it might destroy our relationship forever. But another part of me felt alive, ready for whatever came next. I began to understand that this wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right, about showing that the work I loved, the work I devoted my life to, was worth respect. That teaching wasn't babysitting, that my career was real. Days turned into weeks. I collected documents, notes, and quiet observations. I learned everything I could without raising suspicion. Every piece of information became a weapon. Every late night spent at my desk was another step toward my goal. But then, something unexpected happened. My father began to notice. He started asking questions. Not directly, but in subtle ways. Small comments about my work, about my hours, about what I was doing at night. It was as if he knew something was shifting, though he didn't yet know what. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, poring over papers with a worried look. He didn't see me standing there. I watched him for a long moment. He looked tired, older somehow. Not the untouchable man I remembered from my childhood. He looked vulnerable, and in that moment, I realized the game had changed. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about control. And for the first time, I felt the weight of what I was about to take on. That night, I closed my laptop with a sharp click. I felt something stirring inside me. Something fierce and unrelenting. I knew the path I was on was dangerous, but there was no turning back. The question wasn't whether I could take control of the grant. The question was whether I had the courage to go all the way, and I was ready to find out. The days after that night felt like walking through fog. Every morning I woke with the same thought. Today, I have to get closer. I needed proof. Something undeniable that would give me the power to act. But the closer I got, the harder it became to keep my plan hidden. My father's eyes seemed sharper, as if he was sensing my moves without knowing exactly why. I began to spend more time at his office under the pretense of needing help with my research. Every visit was a careful dance. I watched him sift through folders, his hands trembling slightly when he handled the grant documents. That weakness became my fuel. I began to believe not just that I could succeed, but that I had to. One afternoon, I found myself alone in his study. The room smelled of aged paper and coffee, his comfort zone. On his desk was a folder I hadn't seen before, marked in bold letters. My breath caught. Inside, there were documents, numbers, deadlines, and clauses. It all clicked. The loophole I had suspected, the one that could give me control of the grant, was real. But it was guarded. He had woven it deep into the rules so it would be almost invisible to anyone but him. And now, I knew why. This grant was more than money. It was his legacy. Taking it from him would not just be a legal move, it would be war. That night, I stayed up late with my laptop, piecing it all together. I drew diagrams, wrote notes, and imagined every possible outcome. The more I planned, the more my chest tightened. It was no longer just about proving him wrong. It was about survival, for my career, for my dignity, for everything I believed I deserved. But I wasn't prepared for how much this would cost. I began to feel the strain. I skipped meals, avoided friends, and lived in a constant state of tension. My world narrowed until every thought, every breath was about the next step. Then one evening, my father confronted me, not angrily, quietly. His voice was low but sharp. "Alec, what are you doing?" He didn't ask as if he wanted an answer. It was more like a warning. I froze, heart pounding, the folder of notes hidden in my bag. I told myself not to falter, not to show weakness, but his eyes, full of suspicion, cut through me. I smiled softly, just trying to understand things better. But the lie tasted bitter. From that moment, everything changed. He became watchful, almost paranoid. He locked his desk at night, changed his passwords, and kept fewer papers in plain sight. I knew I had to move faster. The window was closing. I began to collect allies quietly, friends who trusted me, people who knew the world of grants and legal matters better than I did. Together, we formed a plan. It was dangerous, risky, but there was no turning back. I was already in too deep. Late one night, I sat in my room staring at the folder I had taken from his study. The paper edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the power they contained was sharp as a knife. I thought about my father, how he'd see this as betrayal, how he'd never forgive me. But I thought even more about myself, how I'd finally prove I was not a babysitter, not someone who wasted her life on a dream. Weeks passed. I watched, I waited, I prepared. And then, one quiet afternoon, I saw my chance. My father had left for a meeting that he couldn't reschedule. His desk was unlocked. The documents sat there in plain sight. Almost mocking me, I took them. It wasn't just about taking control anymore. It was about making a statement. As I slipped the papers into my bag, my heart thundered. I knew this moment would change everything. My life, my future, our relationship. It was all hanging by a thread. And deep inside, I wondered, was I doing the right thing? Or was I crossing a line I could never come back from? There was no going back now. The day came without warning. I woke up to the sound of rain against my window, the kind of heavy rain that makes the air feel thick and restless. My phone buzzed with a message from one of my allies. Tonight. Just one word. But it carried everything, the moment I had been waiting for, and the risk I had been dreading. By evening, my nerves were frayed. My hands shook as I grabbed the folder from my bag. It was heavier than before, not because of the papers, but because of what they meant. This was no longer just about proving myself. This was about challenging everything my father had built, everything he thought he owned. I could almost hear his voice in my head, calling me a babysitter, telling me teaching wasn't a real career. Tonight, I was about to prove him wrong in a way he would never forget. I made my way to the office where the meeting was being held. The hallways were quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's watching you. My heart was pounding harder with each step. When I reached the door, my hand lingered over the knob. I could hear voices inside, my father's voice among them, calm but sharp. The meeting was underway. My father sat at the head of the table, surrounded by faces I didn't recognize. Investors, board members, people who trusted him without question. And there I was, silent, unseen, watching him speak as if nothing was wrong. Then, in a moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable, I stepped forward. The room went still. My father's head turned sharply toward me. His eyes widened, the kind of look that comes when someone knows they've lost control. I opened my bag, pulling out the folder. The sound of the papers hitting the table was loud, almost deafening in the silence. "This," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "is what you don't want anyone to see." He looked at me then, not with anger, but with something colder. Disappointment, shock, betrayal. I laid the documents out, showing them to everyone in the room. The loopholes, the control clauses, he hidden details, it was all there. Everything he had worked to keep buried. The room filled with murmurs, whispers. I could feel the weight of every gaze on me. My father stood, his face pale. "Alec, what are you doing?" His voice cracked. It wasn't just a question. It was the sound of a man losing everything he believed he could control. "I'm proving you wrong," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "I'm proving myself." He stepped closer, his expression hard. "This isn't just about you. You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I understand that you never believed in me, but I believe in myself." The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. Somewhere in the room, someone gasped. My father's shoulders slumped, and for the first time in years, I saw him unsure. That moment, the silence, the shock, the disbelief, it was the turning point. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a force, a truth, and I knew there was no going back. As the meeting broke into chaos, I stepped back. My heart still pounding, my mind racing. I realized this wasn't just about a grant anymore. It was about justice, about respect, about proving that no one gets to decide your worth. I looked at my father one last time. His eyes held something I had never seen before. Fear. And in that fear, I found my own victory. But the real question lingered in my mind. Was this triumph worth the cost of what we once had? The room was still buzzing with whispers long after the meeting ended. People filed out quietly, some with puzzled expressions, others with looks of approval. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand still resting on the folder. My father was gone. He had slipped out without saying a word. I didn't chase him. Part of me knew that this was a goodbye I couldn't undo. Later that night, I sat alone in my room, the rain still tapping gently at my window. The folder lay open beside me, its papers now more than just evidence. They were proof of something much deeper. A battle for respect, for recognition, for a vida ti. Us that had been silenced for too long. The victory felt strange. I had won the grant, taken control, proven myself. But at what cost? My relationship with my father was broken, perhaps forever. I could almost hear his voice accusing me again, calling me a babysitter, reminding me of everything he thought I could never be. But in my heart, I knew I had changed. This wasn't just about a career anymore. It was about self-worth, about refusing to let someone else define who you are or what you're capable of. I thought about every late night I had spent preparing, every sacrifice I had made, and every moment I had doubted myself. They all led to this moment. The grant wasn't just money, it was a symbol of the fight I had fought quietly, the battle for my dignity. And now, with it in my hands, I knew I had a choice, to rebuild or to walk away. I chose to rebuild, not just for me, but for every voice that had ever been dismissed. I thought about my father one last time. I wondered if he'd ever understand why I did it, or if he would only see it as betrayal. Maybe both were true, but deep inside, I knew I had to stand for myself. This story isn't just mine. It's a story of anyone who's ever been told they weren't enough. A story of courage, of breaking chains, of proving that worth isn't given, it's claimed. And now I ask you this. If you were standing where I was, would you have taken the risk? Would you have crossed the line to claim your truth? Because sometimes the only way to be heard is to make noise so loud it can't be ignored.